I had one child prepped for a transplant and another marked as the donor, and the only honest sentence left in my mouth was that saving one of them might kill the other. The cruelest part was this. The boy under the warming blanket had once been expected to die in infancy, 12 hours earlier. Tell me in the comments, would you have caught the warning sign in time? The rain had been tapping the ambulance bay since dawn when Sadie Mercer came through the doors at Riverside Memorial in Chicago. I saw her mother pushing the wheelchair to fast, one hand on the handle and the other on the girl's shoulder, as if touch alone could keep her from slipping away. Sadie was 11, yellow in the eyes, gray around the mouth, and suddenly small in the way sick children become. Her father carried an overnight bag that looked too light for the kind of fear on his face. Ben came behind them in a soaked red hoodie, close enough that the chair kept brushing his knees. He never complained, only adjusted his steps, and stayed near his sister like protecting her was already his job. I noticed how he tracked every monitor we passed, every alarm, every oxygen port on the wall. Children who know hospitals too well move like that. They listen before they speak, and they study adults' faces before they trust our words. Sadie's chart said abdominal pain, vomiting, fatigue, transfer for urgent transplant evaluation. Her body said something worse. When I took her wrist, her skin felt hot and fragile, and when I asked where it hurt, she drifted halfway through the answer as if speech itself had become heavy. I ordered fresh labs, called pediatric ICU, and watched the room tighten around her. Even before the numbers came back, I knew her liver was failing fast, and taking the rest of her with it. Angela, her mother, answered in clipped, careful sentences. She told me specialists were already discussing transplant and that Ben might be a living donor if things turned desperate enough. Mark, her husband, said almost nothing, but his hand kept gripping the bed rail and letting go. When Ben climbed into the chair beside Sadie, his sleeve slipped back. I caught the pale ridge of an old scar, high on his chest. It vanished quickly, but it left a question that did not. I brought in Dr. Lena Park, my senior resident, because she could read a chart the way other people read weather. While I stabilized Sadie and called transplant surgery, Lena worked through the outside records. The transfer packet focused on Sadie, but Ben's name kept appearing in the margins. Donor workup pending, prior cardiac clearance per family, records unavailable. Records unavailable can mean bureaucracy. It can also mean someone is hiding the part of the story that changes everything. By afternoon, Sadie was upstairs in the ICU, under warm air and hard fluorescent light, with machines doing their best imitation of certainty. I stood at the glass and watched Ben place his hand against it, small palm to cold window, as if he could lend her strength through the barrier. Angela bent down and whispered something that made him nod too quickly. I could not hear her words, but I knew the shape of them. Families in hospitals are always bargaining with God, with memory, and sometimes with the truth. I was halfway through my first cold cup of coffee when Sadie's labs came back ugly enough to change the air in the room. Her mind had already begun to slip in the but in the ICU, the change turned merciless. 1 minute she was asking for water in a cracked whisper, and the next she was staring past her mother's shoulder at something none of us could see. The monitors kept time with a pulse that sounded too fast for an 11-year-old body. I had seen liver failure steal people in inches before, but it always felt crueler in a child. By evening, her gums were bleeding and her hands had started making those weak, restless movements that tell you the brain is being poisoned by what the body can no longer clear. Angela kept repeating Sadie's name as if rhythm alone could anchor her. Mark stood near the sink with his jaw locked so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I explained it plainly, because false softness becomes a kind of cowardice in rooms like that. Her liver was failing, toxins were reaching her brain, and time was turning from days into decisions. Ben was supposed to stay in the family room, but I found him in the hallway with his fists tucked inside his sleeves. He asked me if Sadie was dying with the calm voice children use, when they already know the answer, and only want to see whether an adult will lie. I crouched to his height and told him she was in serious danger. Then he asked whether being a donor would hurt. The question landed harder than it should have, because he sounded less afraid than prepared. Lena found me an hour later with a stack of scanned records and a face gone still in the way young doctors' faces go still when medicine becomes judgment. Ben had not just seen cardiology as an infant. He had survived a congenital heart defect so severe that an outside team had once documented survival beyond infancy as unlikely. There were surgeries, complications, missed follow-ups, and scattered later notes showing that he had done far better than expected. But nowhere did those records describe an uncomplicated child. We ordered an urgent cardiology consult and pulled transplant surgery back into the conversation. Dr. Samuel Ortega read the old notes in silence. His thumb pressed against the page like he was trying to hold the past in place. Then he said the sentence nobody in that room wanted to hear, if Ben's heart still carried even part of that burden. A living donation could turn one dying child into two surgical disasters. No one answered right away. Outside, gurneys rattled and phones rang, but in that room even the ventilation sounded cautious. When we confronted the parents, Angela broke first. Not loudly, just a hand over her mouth and tears she had clearly postponed for days. Mark admitted they had not shared everything because every time they did, another doctor told them what could not be done. They had convinced themselves that survival had erased fragility, that the scar on Ben's chest belonged to the past and nowhere else. I looked through the glass at him sitting beside his sister's bed, feet swinging over the floor, and thought how often adults confuse a miracle with permission. By midnight, the hospital had become that version of itself I have always trusted most. The public lights were dim, the coffee had gone bitter, and every voice sounded either too soft or too sharp. We gathered around a small table with transplant papers, ethics notes, water cups, and the kind of silence that comes when every available option carries a stain. I sat, with my stethoscope heavy on my neck, and listened to specialists circle the same truth. Sadie might not live long enough to receive a deceased donor organ. Cardiology moved fast, because speed is sometimes the only mercy left. Ben's preliminary imaging was not catastrophic, but it was far from clean. His repaired heart showed enough residual strain to make major surgery a risk nobody honest could dress up as bravery. Ortega said he could not ethically remove part of a liver from a child whose own body had spent years surviving the impossible. The donor advocate agreed and added something even harder to hear. Ben sounded too ready, too rehearsed, too willing to save his sister before understanding what refusing might mean. Angela argued with the force of a mother standing at the edge of two graves and trying to step away from both. She said Ben knew what he wanted, that he had lived his whole life proving adults wrong. Mark leaned on the table and said every family asks one child to carry another somehow. Through grief, through work, through silence, through years nobody talks about later. Why was this different, he asked, when this burden could save a life? I answered before anyone else could. A hospital is not allowed to turn love into pressure and call it consent. That was when Ben heard enough to change the night. He had slipped out of the family room and stood just beyond the cracked door, still as a photograph. He looked at me and asked whether he had really been supposed to die when he was a baby. The room went silent in the total way only truth can silence it. Angela reached for him, but he stepped back. He kept his eyes on me, and I understood in that second that parents hide with tenderness while doctors wound with facts. I took him to a quieter room with peeling cartoon clouds on the wall and told him the truth in language his age could survive. I said his heart had been very sick when he was born, and some people had feared he would not live long, but he had fought harder than anyone expected. He touched the scar through his hoodie and stared at the floor for a long time. Then he asked the question that split the night clean open. So was I saved for me or for her? I told him no child is born to be spare parts for anyone. The ethics recommendation came down an hour later, but by then the paper felt secondary. Ben could not be cleared as a donor, not because he was unloved, and not because his wish to help meant nothing, but because our duty to him did not vanish in the shadow of Sadie's need. Angela cried with the quiet exhaustion of someone losing the last, hope she had allowed herself to name. Mark turned away so fast his chair scraped the tile. I signed the note with a hand that felt older than the rest of me. A little after 2 in the morning, Sadie's monitor found a new rhythm, and every person who heard it started moving before thought caught up. Her pressure dropped, her breathing thinned, and the whites of her eyes rolled with the terrible softness that tells you the brain is under siege. I was at the bedside when blood touched the corner of her mouth. The room filled in Leia's nurses. ICU fellow, respiratory therapist, Ortega, Lena, and the air changed from tense to electric. Some bodies reach a point where they stop pretending they have 1 more hour to negotiate. Sadie had reached it. I remember the metallic smell of blood warming under bright lights, gloves snapping onto damp wrists, Angela being held back with tears on both sides of the struggle. Mark kept saying please until the word lost its shape. We pushed medication, called for blood, adjusted ventilation, elevated her head, and spoke in clipped phrases because there was no room left for softness. Lena read out lab changes with a voice steadier than her years. In a better world, courage would be enough. In mine, courage usually just buys time. Ben should never have seen any of it, but he saw enough. I caught him in the hallway through the open door, one hand flat against the wall, his face emptied of childhood. He wasn't looking at the blood or the noise. He was looking at his mother, and that told me exactly which damage would last longest. I stepped out, knelt in front of him, and told him this was not his fault and not his job to fix. My hand shook when I said it. Sometimes we tell children the truth at the exact moment we fear they can no longer believe it. Then transplant coordination called. A deceased donor liver had become available from Indianapolis, close enough in size to make the room change shape around the possibility. It was not a miracle in any cheap sense. Somewhere, another family had just entered the worst night of their lives and chosen generosity while still drowning in it. But in our world, that kind of grief can become another child's pulse. Ortega took the call, asked the brutal questions only surgeons know to ask, and when he hung up he did not smile. He only said, if procurement stays on time, we have a chance. The next hour became a corridor of motion. I rode with Sadie to the operating suite, while the transport ventilator rattled beside us, and fluorescent. Ceiling panels flashed over her face in pale intervals. Angela walked alongside the gurney whispering a lullaby into the chaos. Mark stayed back with Ben because someone finally had to choose the living child in front of him over the dying one moving through steel doors. At the OR threshold, Sadie stirred just enough to make a sound. I leaned close and told her the only thing in that room I could promise without lying. Her brother was safe. The transplant lasted until morning. I stayed past my shift, past reason, past the point where the weight of my stethoscope felt like a second spine, because some cases stop belonging to the clock. When Ortega finally came out, cap lines carved deep into his forehead, he looked like a man who had wrestled skill and sorrow all night. He said the graft was in, blood flow looked good, and the next day would decide what hope was allowed to mean. Angela folded into Mark's chest. Ben sat very still, with both hands over the scar on his chest, guarding the body we had finally chosen not to spend. Morning light always feels indecent after a night like that. It came through the ICU, blinds in thin gray stripes, touching for poles, plastic tubing. And the stiff shoulders of people who had forgotten ordinary life existed. Sadie lay pale and swollen beneath blankets, lines, and machines, but she was alive. Sometimes survival enters a room quietly, not with triumph, but with a softer kind of vigilance. I stood at the doorway and listened to the ventilator breathe for her, each mechanical exhale sounding less like defeat than a bridge. Angela tried to thank everyone separately. which is something families do when gratitude is the only task they can still perform without falling apart. Her voice cracked on every other sentence. Mark found me near the sink and apologized for what they had hidden about Ben. He said desperation had made them superstitious, and superstition had made them dishonest. I told him fear does that to people, but fear does not get to make medical decisions for children. He nodded like a man finally willing to be judged, because waiting had become worse than the verdict. Later that day, Ben came to the ICU with a child life specialist and a knit cap someone had handed him during the night. He asked whether Sadie had another child's liver inside her now. And I told him yes, part of one, enough to give her a chance. He was quiet for a moment, then asked whether that child had died. I told him another family had lost someone they loved very much and still chose to help. Ben looked through the glass at his sister and whispered, "Then I have to be worth saving too. Very few sentences stay under my skin for years." That one did. By the second postoperative day, Sadie opened her eyes. Not for long, and not with any cinematic clarity, just a brief return through sedation and pain. Angela cried into both hands. Mark laughed once, a broken sound, then covered his mouth as if joy itself had become unfamiliar. Sadie could not speak, but when Ben stepped to the bedside and said her name, she moved her fingers toward him over the blanket. I watched his face change in that instant. Not healed, but released from becoming a sacrifice. The paperwork after a case like this always feels obscene in its normalcy. Consent forms, donor network records, cardiology recommendations for Ben, psychosocial follow-up. Ethics summaries pages of language, trying to pin down what happened without bleeding on the margins. Lena sat beside me finishing her notes, holding herself differently now than she had the day before. Every resident begins by thinking medicine is mainly science. Sooner or later, they learn it is also testimony. She asked whether we had done the right thing. I told her we had done the least harmful thing available, and sometimes that is the closest medicine gets to righteousness. I saw the Mercers 3 weeks later in follow-up. Sadie was thinner, stitched, and tired, but color had started returning to her face in careful increments. Ben stood beside her, with apple juice in one hand and a real cardiology plan finally tucked under Angela's arm. Mark shook my hand with both of his, and Angela cried again, softer this time. Families imagine hospitals remember them by diagnosis. They are wrong. We remember them by the moment they told the truth, or failed to, and by what it cost everyone in the room. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. I have spent more than half my life in emergency rooms, and I still do not trust the stories people tell in the first 5 minutes. Not because families are cruel, but because fear edits memory faster than grief does. It keeps what sounds survivable and buries what feels unforgivable. I still think about Ben's question more than Sadie's surgery. Was I saved for me or for her? There are grown men who live entire lives without asking what they have been worth to other people. An 8-year-old asked it under fluorescent light and deserved an answer strong enough to grow with him. Hospitals like to celebrate rescue, and sometimes they should. But rescue becomes dangerous when it starts sounding holy no matter the cost. I have learned to distrust any plan that asks the most vulnerable person in the room to carry the heaviest moral weight. Children are not backup plans. They are not inventory. What stayed with me most was not the transplant itself, though I can still hear the gurney wheels and smell iron in the air. It was the moment Mark remained in the hallway with Ben while Angela followed Sadie to the OR. For the first time that night, the family chose both children. Medicine does not give us clean endings. Sadie will carry another family's final gift for the rest of her life. Ben will grow up with a scar on his chest and a memory formed too early. Angela and Mark will probably spend years forgiving themselves in uneven pieces. I learned again that survival is not the only miracle worth defending. Sometimes the greater miracle is refusing to spend one life as the price of another when panic says you should. That is the scar this case left in me, and I have stopped wishing it would fade.